Hey guys, welcome back. Or maybe welcome for the very first time. If you're here, it's probably late. The lights are dimmed, or maybe they're just off completely, which is perfect. You've got the comfy pillow, the heavy blanket, and your brain is just ready to be gently folded up and put away for the night. So let's just float right into it. Take a deep breath and let it out. Tonight, we're going to be talking about a period in history that, on paper, sounds like it should be full of screaming and traumatic action, the kind of thing that keeps you awake. But don't worry, we're going to slow it right down. We're going to look at the slow motion, completely avoidable, and often deeply awkward personal disasters that led to one of the biggest, most famous, and ultimately most tragic political meltdowns in European history, the French Revolution. We're not talking marching armies or ringing bells. We're talking about the cumulative weight of bad decisions, bad hygiene, and truly disastrous genetics. So, dim those screens, settle right in, and let's go all the way back to the comfortable, opulent, and yet financially self-immolating world of 18th century France. The legacy of the great-grandfathers. To understand the royal disaster we call Louis XVI, we actually have to briefly, very briefly, mention his ancestors. Because, as is so often the case with hereditary monarchy, the main problem isn't the current guy, it's the previous guys who left a truly impossible tab. You, of course, know of Louis XIV, the legendary Sun King. He's the guy who built Versailles, which, if you ever go, is exactly the kind of place you build when you have absolutely no sense of budgetary restraint and simply decide that actually nature is wrong and everything should be a mirror and a manicured hedge. He reigned for ages, built this insane palace, and spent France's treasury like a teenager with their first credit card. He was the kind of person who decided, yes, a single, humble hunting lodge outside Paris is fine, but you know what would be better? A 700-room architectural monument dedicated to my own superiority. Now, Louis XIV had a successor, his great-grandson, Louis XV. Louis XV was called Louis the Beloved, which is one of those ironic historical nicknames that should immediately tell you things went downhill fast. He inherited this machine of absolute monarchy, the divine right of kings, all that jazz, but he, personally, was far more interested in his, let's say, extracurricular activities. He was a man of taste, though maybe not of restraint. He was quite handsome, apparently, and had a string of famous mistresses, including the utterly iconic Madame de Pompadour. The thing about Louis XV is that while he was busy in his private apartments, the government was simply coasting. The enormous debt inherited from the Sun King? Still there. The completely unjust tax system where the nobility and clergy didn't have to pay much, but the actual farmers and workers were bled dry? Still there. The king was the center of the universe, but he increasingly preferred to keep the universe at arm's length. He let the administrative rot just sort of settle in. So when we finally get to our main character, around the year 1774, he inherits the title of King of France and Navarre, and more importantly, he inherits an empty treasury, a broken tax system, and a population that is slowly, quietly simmering with resentment. And he's 19. That's always the best time to inherit an $80 billion debt and a hostile populace, right? The Unwilling King, Louis Auguste. The full name, if you're interested in the details, was Louis Auguste de France. He wasn't actually supposed to be king. That's a key detail. Louis Auguste was the third son of the Dauphin, Louis, and Louis XV's eldest grandson. His older brother, Louis, the Duke of Burgundy, was the one groomed for the throne. Louis the August was supposed to be, well, the spare. But as is so often the case with hereditary monarchy, tragedy struck. The little Duke of Burgundy died young. Then Louis Auguste's father, the actual Dauphin, died. And then his mother, the Dauphine, died. All of this before Louis Auguste was even a teenager. So he suddenly goes from being the awkward third son to the heir apparent, the future Sun King successor. This is where the genetic weirdness starts to peek in. Louis Auguste, our future Louis XVI, was a deeply unsuited man for the most high-pressure job in Europe. He was extremely shy, he was clumsy, he was quiet, he hated the pomp and ceremony at Versailles, which, remember, was designed specifically for pomp and ceremony. He had this profoundly awkward, shuffling walk, and he was, quite frankly, overweight, or at least too heavy for the fine silk breeches of the age. Think less of a magnificent, intimidating king, and more of a slightly uncomfortable, overgrown boy who just wants to go home. What did he like doing instead of being the absolute center of the world? He liked tinkering. Specifically, Louis XVI had an obsession with locksmithing. Yes, the King of France, who had hundreds of staff and advisors, would often retreat to a hidden workshop in the attic of Versailles to actually file, hammer, and test keys and locks. There is a powerful, almost pathetic irony in this. Here is the man who is supposed to hold the key to the entire kingdom, the master lock of the French state, and he physically retreats to a small, dark room to master the mechanisms of literal tiny locks. He spent hours there in his little shop, avoiding the crush of courtiers and the heavy weight of a collapsing financial system. He literally preferred the company of metal tools to human beings. The marriage was a tragic comedy. The awkward boy needed a wife. Of course he did. Royals don't get to choose who they love, they get to choose who provides the most useful diplomatic alliance. In 1770, at the age of 15, Louis Auguste was married to Marie Antoine Josepha Johanna, an Archduchess of Austria. You probably know her better as Marie Antoinette. This marriage was a total disaster from the very first minute, but for the most pathetic and human of reasons. The union was meant to solidify the Franco-Austrian alliance, but for Louis and Marie, it was just awkward. He was large, shy, and obsessed with locks. She was beautiful, vivacious, and loved fashion, gambling, and parties. They had almost nothing in common, and he had no idea how to talk to her. And here is the most crucial, sleep-inducing detail of their early marriage. It wasn't consummated for 7 years. 7 years! Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were husband and wife living together for 7 years, and they did not have sexual relations. This wasn't just a private matter. It was an absolute public crisis. Inbred royal dynasties require heirs. The entire future of the kingdom rested on the queen getting pregnant, and the queen simply wasn't. The snarky, gossiping court of Versailles, of course, had a field day. People assumed all sorts of things, that Louis was impotent, that Marie Antoinette was barren, that it was a curse. The king's own brother, the Count of Provence, later Louis XVIII, started dropping rumors about Louis's supposed disability. It was absolutely mortifying for both of them, especially for Marie Antoinette, who was trapped in a foreign court with absolutely no status until she produced a male heir. Historians today believe it was a relatively common and curable physical issue called phimosis. Louis XVI was apparently simply too shy or too awkward to seek medical help for his issue for years. Can you imagine? The King of France, the absolute monarch, refusing to go to a doctor because it would be embarrassing. The state of the entire monarchy was being threatened by a simple, treatable medical condition, all because of Louis's profound social anxiety.
finally, in 1777, it was consummated. And of course he was capable. The couple immediately started having children, proving the entire 7 years of international gossip, political anxiety, and personal humiliation was completely and totally unnecessary. That, my friends, is the deep, dark irony of this historical catastrophe. The fate of the monarchy hinged on a shy man being too embarrassed to talk about a minor physical problem. The weight of the crown. In 1774, Louis XV died. Our shy, 20-year-old lock-obsessed Louis Auguste became King Louis XVI. When he was told the news that his grandfather had just died of smallpox, Louis XVI supposedly fell to his knees, burst into tears, and cried,
If you're still with me. The world outside is probably still dark and quiet, which is exactly how we like it. We're going to continue our gentle glide down the slippery slope of 18th century French dynastic dysfunction. When we left off, we had a king, Louis XVI, who was perfectly nice but profoundly unsuited to his job, preferring the solitude of his attic workshop. And we had a queen, Marie Antoinette, who is now publicly seen as the entire kingdom's most expensive liability, which was only partly true. Let's focus on the queen for a moment, because the growing popular hatred for her became a truly toxic, fuel-injected component of the revolution. It's fascinating how one person can become the lightning rod for centuries of systemic corruption. The problem of Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette, remember, came to France as a 15-year-old Austrian archduchess. She was a fish completely out of water in the stiff, deeply cynical and gossipy court of Versailles. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, had essentially shipped her off as a diplomatic tool, telling her, "You are now French." But the French court never accepted her. To them, she was always the Austrian woman, l'Autrichienne, which in French is a neat little xenophobic pun that basically translates to the Austrian bitch. She dealt with this crushing isolation and constant scrutiny by doing the one thing she was good at, spending money and having fun. She was charming, she loved fashion, and she loved to gamble. Unfortunately, her gambling debts were legendary. If you're still with me. The world outside is probably still dark and quiet, which is exactly how we like it. We're going to continue our gentle glide down the slippery slope of 18th century French dynastic dysfunction. When we left off, we had a king, Louis XVI, who was perfectly nice but profoundly unsuited to his job, preferring the solitude of his attic workshop. And we had a queen, Marie Antoinette, who was now publicly seen as the entire kingdom's most expensive liability, which was only partly true. Let's focus on the queen for a moment, because the growing popular hatred for her became a truly toxic, fuel-injected component of the revolution. It's fascinating how one person can become the lightning rod for centuries of systemic corruption. The problem of Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette, remember, came to France as a 15-year-old Austrian archduchess. She was a fish completely out of water in the stiff, deeply cynical and gossipy court of Versailles. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, had essentially shipped her off as a diplomatic tool, telling her, "You are now French." But the French court never accepted her. To them, she was always the Austrian woman, l'Autrichienne, which in French is a neat little xenophobic pun that basically translates to the Austrian bitch.
She dealt with this crushing isolation and constant scrutiny by doing the one thing she was good at: spending money and having fun. She was charming, she loved fashion, and she loved to gamble. Unfortunately, her gambling debts were legendary. She was absolutely obsessed with the high-stakes card game of Pharaoh and often lost astronomical sums. When you are the king's wife in a country teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, this is probably not the wisest hobby. But the real spending wasn't even on gambling or on the incredibly complex, often ludicrous fashions she pioneered. She was building her own little escape right on the grounds of Versailles. She detested the main palace, all those cold marble halls and thousands of staring courtiers. So she commissioned the Petit Trianon, a smaller, much more human-scale palace, and then the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's Hamlet. Now, the Hamlet is really the perfect absurd symbol of the monarchy's disconnect. She built an entire fake village, a little cluster of charming rustic farmhouses with thatched roofs, a little lake, a watermill, and a dairy. She would retreat there with her intimate friends and play act at being a milkmaid or a shepherdess. The irony here is so thick you could use it as butter. While the actual French peasantry were starving because of crippling taxes and famine, the Queen was pretending to be a peasant in a highly manicured, absurdly expensive, entirely fake peasant village. It cost millions of livres, and to the public, it was proof that the Queen was not only foreign and frivolous, but completely delusional about the suffering of her subjects. The simmering resentment against the Queen finally boiled over in the mid-1880s with a truly convoluted and deeply embarrassing scandal that has come to be known as the Affair of the Diamond Necklace. And if you need a truly sleep-inducing example of courtly incompetence and ridiculous vanity, this is it. The short version is this: a truly massive, stunning, and ludicrously expensive diamond necklace had been created for Louis XV's former mistress, Madame du Barry. But before it was finished, Louis XV died. So the jewelers were left with this multi-million-franc piece of jewelry and no buyer. They offered it to Marie Antoinette. She, to her credit, actually refused it. She said France was too poor and the money would be better spent on ships, which was a surprisingly responsible financial decision for her. But a completely untalented, disgraced courtier named Cardinal Rohan desperately wanted to get back into the Queen's good graces. Rohan was a well-known vain buffoon, and he fell prey to a truly spectacular con artist named Jeanne de Valois-Saint-Remy, who styled herself as the Countess de Lamothe. Lamothe convinced Rohan that she was secretly the Queen's confidant, and that the Queen desperately wanted the necklace but couldn't buy it openly due to court protocol. Lamothe fabricated a huge correspondence of forged letters written in the Queen's name, asking Rohan to secretly purchase the necklace on her behalf and promising to repay him in installments. Rohan, blinded by vanity, agreed. He signed the papers, he took the necklace from the jewelers, and he handed it over to Lamothe, believing he was giving it to the Queen. Lamothe, of course, immediately broke the necklace into pieces and sold the diamonds in London and Paris. When the jewelers finally came to Marie Antoinette demanding payment, the entire scam unraveled. The King and Queen were absolutely furious, realizing they had been used. They arrested the cardinal right in Versailles, which was a huge, shocking breach of aristocratic privilege. The trial that followed was a public relations nightmare that the monarchy simply could not afford. Even though Marie Antoinette was proven completely innocent, she had nothing to do with the purchase or the con. The Parisian public assumed she was guilty. They couldn't believe a cardinal would be duped. It was easier to believe the foreign queen was lying to get out of paying a bill for a ridiculous diamond necklace. The court of public opinion saw the trial as the monarchy attacking a representative of the French aristocracy. The acquittal of the cardinal and the subsequent banishment of La Motte was seen not as justice, but as the queen's failure to get her revenge. This whole tawdry, silly, complex drama didn't cause the revolution, but it absolutely destroyed the monarchy's remaining public credibility. It cemented Marie Antoinette as the central, greedy villain of the French stage. The final financial collapse. While the Queen was dealing with public scandals, Louis XVI was cycling through finance ministers like they were fashionable hats. After Necker, the optimistic spinner of accounts, was forced out, Louis brought in Calonne. Calonne recognized the crisis was no longer about cuts, it was about structural reform. He proposed a massive plan in 1786 that looked suspiciously like Turgot's old plan. Tax all landowners, regardless of their social status. Clergy, nobility, everyone pays. Also, let's stimulate the economy by deregulating grain trade. This was the last best chance to save the monarchy. But Louis, again, was too weak to push it through. He had to get approval not from the...
All right, settle in, because we're moving into the part of the story where things stop being politely awkward and start being politically catastrophic. But don't worry, we'll keep it low-key. We're looking at the small, petty slights and procedural nightmares that accidentally triggered a total regime collapse. When we left off in the spring of 1789, the Estates General had finally been summoned after 175 years of dusty silence. The 1,200 or so delegates, clergy, nobility, and the commoners of the Third Estate had all arrived at Versailles, the magnificent palace built by Louis XIV to project absolute, unquestionable power. The problem with the room. The delegates of the Third Estate, remember, were numerous. They had 600 people, matching the other two orders combined. They were also smart. They were mostly lawyers, businessmen, and philosophers, and they arrived ready to work. The problem, as is so often the case in large bureaucracies, was seating arrangements. The three estates were supposed to meet separately to verify their credentials, but the Third Estate immediately insisted that all three estates should meet together and vote by head. Each delegate gets one vote. Not by order, each estate gets one collective vote. This was the whole point of their journey. If they voted by head, their 600 votes, plus a few progressive nobles and minor clergy, would guarantee them a majority and allow them to pass the tax reforms France desperately needed. The First and Second Estates naturally refused. Why would they voluntarily give up their 2-to-1 power advantage and agree to start paying taxes? They just sat there, politely stalling. The entire political process, the last hope for a financial solution, ground to an agonizing halt over a simple procedural dispute. It lasted for weeks. Weeks of delegates staring at each other, waiting for someone to blink. The weather was probably nice, the palace gardens were blooming, and the kingdom was slowly dying of financial neglect. Finally, after 6 weeks of this totally pointless procedural deadlock, the Third Estate had enough. Inspired by the writings of their fiery representative, the Abbé Sieyès, who was technically clergy but voted with the commoners, they made a bold, quiet move. On June 17th, 1789, the Third Estate declared that they alone were the legitimate representatives of the nation. They had the numbers and they had the mandate. Therefore, they were no longer the Third Estate, they were the National Assembly. This was an act of unilateral revolution done not with cannons, but with a piece of paper. It completely undermined the king's authority. The absolute monarchy was based on the king summoning the estates to advise him. It was not based on the commoners deciding they were the government. The Tennis Court Oath. Louis XVI, being Louis XVI, tried to respond decisively but clumsily. He decided the solution was a royal session, where he would lay down the law and make some moderate concessions, and then everyone would go back to their separate rooms and continue their separate useless meetings. To prepare the hall for this important royal session, Louis' staff simply ordered that the meeting room of the Third Estate, the Salle des États, be locked. It was a Saturday morning, June 20th. The delegates of the newly self-proclaimed National Assembly arrived for their meeting, only to find the door literally barred and guarded by royal soldiers. This was not a dramatic move of suppression. It was probably just a totally bureaucratic mishap. They were locked out because the palace staff needed to bring in carpets and tapestries for the king's speech on Monday. The delegates, however, saw this as an intentional act of aggression by the king to dissolve their new assembly. They were not going to be deterred by a closed door. So they, led by a firebrand named Mirabeau, didn't march on the palace. They simply found the nearest available large empty space, which ironically was the king's own royal tennis court, the Jeu de Paume room. And here, in a large, drafty room, usually reserved for a game that was essentially 18th century squash, the National Assembly took the famous tennis court oath. Standing shoulder to shoulder, they swore an oath not to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances require until the constitution of the kingdom is established. Think about that moment. The entire future of France, the end of 800 years of Bourbon monarchy, being decided in a room where aristocrats usually hit balls around. The king locks their door not out of tyranny, but out of scheduling issues, and they respond by holding a constituent assembly in a sports complex. It's the perfect blend of bureaucratic incompetence and revolutionary drama. Louis was naturally mortified. When he finally held his royal session on Monday, he scolded the delegates, invalidated the National Assembly's actions, and ordered them to disperse. Then he left the hall. The clergy and the nobility shuffled out. The delegates of the Third Estate, however, stayed put, silent and defiant. When the king's master of ceremonies, the Marquis de Dreux, came to tell them to leave, Mirabeau delivered his iconic, slightly overdramatic line, which you have to imagine being shouted back to a powdered courtier. "Go tell those who sent you that we are here by the will of the people, and we will not leave except by the force of bayonets." Louis XVI, when informed that the delegates were simply refusing to move, reportedly shrugged and said, "Oh, well, let them stay." And that, everyone, is how the King of France ceded his power. Not through a grand battle, but through a weary sigh of resignation. For the next few weeks, Louis tried to find some way to deal with this unauthorized, stubborn National Assembly. He started massing royal troops around Paris and Versailles. This was meant to intimidate the revolutionaries, but it had the opposite effect. It just convinced the Parisians that the king was preparing a military crackdown. Then came the second and fatal misstep. Louis, heavily pressured by the hardline courtiers, especially his brother, the Count of Artois, decided he had to take a stand. His target? The one man in the government the people actually trusted, Jacques Necker. Necker, the Genevan banker who had published the state's finances, was dismissed on July 11th. The order was delivered discreetly. Necker was asked to leave Paris immediately and secretly. Louis was attempting to quietly remove the last moderate break on the system. This act, more than any troop movement, was the spark. Necker was a popular hero, a symbol of reform and financial hope. When the news of his dismissal reached Paris on July 12th, it was interpreted as the final absolute proof that the king was rejecting reform, rejecting the National Assembly, and preparing a massacre orchestrated by Marie Antoinette and the reactionary nobility. Parisians flooded the streets. Orators like Camille Desmoulins stood on tables in cafes, haranguing the crowds, yelling that the king's army was about to march on the city. People began wearing green cockades, the color of hope, and reportedly Necker's livery, to identify themselves. The mobs surged through the city, smashing customs barriers where hated taxes were collected, and beginning to loot places where arms could be found. The city authorities, panicking, created an emergency militia, the Paris Commune, and started looking for weapons. This brings us, finally, to the event that is now celebrated as the start of the revolution, but which was really another administrative farce, the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789. The Bastille was not a political prison housing hundreds of freedom fighters. It was an extremely old medieval fortress used mostly as a state prison. By 1789, it was mostly symbolic and completely obsolete. It was mainly used to lock up unruly nobles, forgers, or people deemed mentally unstable by their families. On July 14th, how many prisoners were actually in the Bastille? 7. Yes, 7. 4 of them were forgers, 2 of them were lunatics whose families wanted them institutionalized, and 1 was a completely non-famous gentleman who was a suspect in a plot to kill the king. A completely forgettable, low-level prison. The crowd didn't march on the Bastille to free these 7 individuals. They marched on it because they believed it contained vast stores of gunpowder and muskets needed to arm the new city militia. The governor of the fortress was an old military man named Bernard René Delaunay. Delaunay was completely undermanned. He had about 80 aging French Invalides soldiers and 30 or so Swiss mercenaries. He had no food and no ability to feed the people outside. He was simply waiting.
If you're still floating along with the rhythmic, low-level incompetence of the French monarchy, then you're doing great. We've established that the storming of the Bastille was mostly an administrative mishap, but its symbolic weight was enormous. It told everyone in France that the king was weak, that power was in the street, and it was officially open season on the old order. Now, we need to talk about what happened outside Paris in the late summer of 1789. Because while the lawyers and the National Assembly were trying to draft a constitution, the entire French countryside descended into a low-grade, widespread, and largely irrational panic that we call the Great Fear, la Grande Peur. The spread of sleepy panic. The Great Fear is one of those wonderfully absurd historical moments that demonstrates how easily rumor and general anxiety can cause widespread chaos. After the Bastille fell, news traveled across France, often distorted, exaggerated, and filtered through local anxieties. The rumor that spread like wildfire was that the nobility, furious at the events in Paris, were raising armies of brigands and mercenaries, often called aristocratic plots or just the enemy, to sweep through the countryside, burn crops, and starve the people back into submission. There was absolutely no truth to this. The nobility were generally either packing their bags to flee the country or nervously polishing their silverware at home. They were not organizing brigand armies. But logic, of course, rarely matters when fear takes hold. So, what happened? The peasants, preemptively afraid of non-existent brigands, decided the best defense was a good offense.
They armed themselves, not always with actual weapons, but often with farming tools and pitchforks, and started marching. But instead of fighting imaginary armies, they marched on the symbols of their real oppression, the chateaux of the local lords. They weren't interested in killing the nobles, although a few were hurt. They were interested in the paperwork. They broke into the chateau and demanded the terrier, the ancient, dusty registers that contained the records of all the feudal dues and obligations they owed to the lord. All those documents detailing who owed what chickens, how many days of labor, and what percentage of the harvest, all the centuries of economic oppression were right there in the estate archives. The peasants simply seized those documents and, in a great, satisfying wave of bureaucratic destruction, publicly burned them. This low-level, paper-burning revolt was revolutionary. It completely dismantled the feudal system from the bottom up, not through legislative action, but through decentralized, pitchfork-powered arson. The nobles, suddenly finding their entire source of income and power going up in smoke, were terrified. Many fled, becoming émigrés in neighboring countries. The Declaration and the Dinner Party. The National Assembly, still debating in Versailles, was utterly panicked by the Great Fear. They realized the entire structure of France was collapsing. So, in one of the most famous and exhausting all-night sessions of legislative history, on the night of August 4th, 1789, a few progressive nobles stood up and made grand, dramatic gestures of sacrifice. One noble would renounce their hunting rights, then another would renounce their exclusive right to mill grain. This quickly spiraled into competitive frenzy of self-abnegation. By the time the sun came up, the Assembly had formally abolished the entire feudal system. No more seigneurial courts, no more tithes to the church, no more ancient dues. The legal structure of medieval France was officially declared null and void, all thanks to a wave of agrarian panic. A few weeks later, the Assembly, borrowing heavily from Enlightenment philosophy and recent American revolutionary documents, passed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. It was a beautiful, soaring document, full of phrases like, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights." It enshrined concepts like liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. But here's the quiet irony. Louis XVI, still technically the absolute monarch and residing in Versailles, refused to sign it. He was under no illusion that this document meant the end of his power. He politely resisted. Meanwhile, financial anxiety was still gripping Paris. The hard, poor harvest had led to astronomical bread prices. A working person might spend 80% of their daily wage just to buy a loaf of bread. Into this tense, hungry, and revolutionary atmosphere, Louis XVI made his next, deeply unhelpful decision. He brought more troops, the Flanders Regiment, to Versailles to protect the royal family and, crucially, to intimidate the Assembly. To welcome these new troops, the royal bodyguard hosted a massive, drunken, and utterly opulent dinner party on October 1st. They threw open the doors of the Versailles Opera House for the banquet. During the party, wine flowed, toasts were made to the royal family, and, in a deeply provocative display, the officers reportedly trampled on the red, white, and blue revolutionary cockade, replacing it with the white Bourbon cockade. This news traveled 12 miles from Versailles to the perpetually hungry, volatile streets of Paris. The public didn't hear a nice welcome dinner. They heard the starving king's troops are having an orgy, dancing on the revolution's flag, and stocking up for a siege. The March of the Women. This brings us to the October days, a defining, strange, and entirely food-motivated chapter in the revolution. On October 5th, 1789, a huge crowd began to gather in Paris. It started with the women of the central marketplace, the Halles, the market women, Poissardes. They were frustrated, they were hungry, and they were the ones who had to deal with the impossibly high price of bread every single day. They didn't start with political ideology, they started with empty stomachs. Their demand was simple: bread, and they decided the simplest way to solve this was to bring the problem directly to the king. The crowd, which eventually swelled to thousands of people, mostly women but also a few men dressed in women's clothing, marched the 12 miles from Paris to Versailles. It was raining, it was messy, it was a long, cold, hungry commute. They were armed with whatever they could find: kitchen knives, pikes, old muskets, and sticks. They arrived at Versailles completely soaking wet and absolutely furious late in the afternoon. They invaded the National Assembly Hall, sitting down and demanding action. The delegates, mostly well-off male lawyers, were terrified of the massive, angry, hungry women. Eventually, the women stormed the palace gates and burst into the formal halls, demanding an audience with the king. Louis XVI, still deeply uncomfortable with confrontation, did the only thing he felt he could do. He agreed to meet a small delegation of the market women, and he promised them food. He signed a decree promising to send massive grain shipments to Paris, and perhaps more crucially, he finally, reluctantly, signed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Problem solved, right? Not quite. During the night, some of the mob managed to get into the private wing of the palace. They found Marie Antoinette's chambers. The queen, warned by her guards, fled down a secret passage to her husband's room moments before the rioters burst in, stabbing her bed multiple times. It was a chaotic, brief, and violent moment that demonstrated how thin the royal security really was. By the next morning, October 6th, the Lafayette, head of the National Guard, had managed to restore some order. But the crowd was still there, packed onto the great marble courtyard, and they had a new demand, a more existential demand. The king and queen must leave Versailles and move to Paris. The logic was practical and revolutionary. The king had to be moved out of the protective bubble of his father's and great-grandfather's palace and brought to the capital, where the people could quite literally keep an eye on him. They wanted the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy, the Dauphin, the heir, to come and live among them. Louis XVI, again seeing no way out, agreed. The royal family departed Versailles for Paris on October 6, 1789. The journey was slow, humiliating, and utterly bizarre. The National Guard marched ahead and behind the royal carriage, but the core of the procession was the massive, raucous, and heavily armed crowd. They carried the heads of the 2 guards who had been killed in the palace on pikes. They also carried loaves of bread impaled on pikes. They hauled cannon, and they shouted things like, "We are bringing the baker's wife, and the baker's boy." Marie Antoinette, looking out of the window of the gilded carriage, saw the Parisian women marching right outside, some of them still blood-spattered. The royal family was installed in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, a much older, grimier, and less secure palace that had not been properly used since the time of Louis XIV. The magnificent, opulent Versailles, the symbol of absolute power, was left behind, empty and cold. In just 6 months,
take a nice, slow, deep breath. We've established that the king is no longer absolute, the queen is universally hated, and the entire royal family is living, rather uncomfortably, in the old, drafty Tuileries Palace in the heart of Paris. They are, essentially, prisoners of the Parisian people, though they are still officially the heads of state. We are now in the period between late 1789 and the middle of 1791, a time when the National Assembly was frantically trying to invent a new country. They were attempting to transition France from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy, which is a bit like trying to cross a massive roaring river on a single wobbly plank of wood. The invention of a new France. Life inside the Tuileries Palace for Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette was a study in frustrating routine and total lack of privacy. They were guarded by the National Guard, commanded by the Marquis de Lafayette, the hero of two revolutions. While Lafayette was personally devoted to the royal family, his guards were loyal to the revolution, meaning the king and queen couldn't step outside without permission, and their every move was reported. Louis XVI, always a man of routine and quiet hobbies, tried to adapt. He was still technically the king, and he was forced to approve the torrent of new laws pouring out of the National Assembly. And they were busy laws. The Assembly was tearing down the old structure of France, piece by piece. Administrative chaos. They completely redrew the map of France, dividing the ancient provinces into 83 tidy rectangular departments. No more Burgundy or Brittany. Now it's just Department 17 and Department 55. They were obsessed with geometric tidiness. Church disruption. The biggest change, and arguably the most fatal error of the Assembly, was the civil constitution of the clergy. This law basically turned the French Catholic Church into a state bureaucracy. Priests and bishops were to be elected by citizens and paid by the state. They were required to take a public oath of loyalty to the state. This was an absolute offense to the Pope and to the deeply devout Louis XVI. It forced a terrible choice on the French clergy and created a huge schism between juring priests, oath-taking priests, and non-juring priests, refusing. Louis XVI was a very simple man who genuinely believed in the divine right of kings, and he saw himself as the first son of the church. Approving the confiscation of church lands, the abolition of monastic orders, and the humiliating election of priests was, in his eyes, a mortal sin. He was doing it out of political necessity, but his conscience was breaking. The Queen's shadowy efforts. While Louis XVI was quietly sinking into religious despair, Marie Antoinette was busy. She was utterly convinced that the revolution was just a terrible temporary mistake that would eventually be corrected by force. She believed the only way out was for a foreign power, her brother Emperor Leopold II of Austria, to intervene. She began sending secret, encoded letters out of the Tuileries Palace. These letters were full of urgent pleas for military help, providing details on the strength and weakness of the National Guard, and urging the émigrés, the royalist nobles who had fled, to raise an army. Her political meddling was disastrous for Louis XVI. Even though she was acting to save the monarchy, she ensured that every radical suspicion about her, that she was an Austrian agent, that she hated the French people, that she was planning a foreign invasion, was absolutely, completely true. She was constantly undermining the already fragile political process. The escape plan, an utter, predictable failure. By the spring of 1791, Louis XVI felt completely trapped. The king, who loved hunting and needed to take communion from a non-juring priest, could do neither. He was no longer king of France. He was merely a constitutional figurehead who felt he was being forced to condemn his soul. His only solution was to flee Paris. The plan for the flight to Varennes in June 1791 was developed by a Swedish count named Axel von Fersen, who was almost certainly Marie Antoinette's lover, because why would you not add deeply personal romantic intrigue to a high-stakes geopolitical escape plan? The plan was simple: disguise themselves, slip out of the palace, and drive to the eastern border fortress of Montmédy, where they would be safe among loyal royalist troops. Once safe, Louis could renounce the constitution he had been forced to sign and negotiate from a position of military strength. The plan was executed with breathtaking, almost comic levels of incompetence. The carriage, Instead of taking several small, fast carriages, which would be inconspicuous, Louis insisted on a massive, heavy, slow 6-horse coach designed for comfortable royal travel, known as the berline. It was painted in brightly identifiable royal yellow and green. It was basically a giant, slow billboard saying, "The King of France is escaping right now." The disguise. Louis, instead of looking like an ordinary traveler, dressed as a valet, a footman, to his own fake entourage, which meant he was dressing down for the first time in his life. He wore a loud, conspicuous gray outfit. Marie Antoinette dressed like a German baroness. Both were terrible at pretending to be commoners, mostly because they had no idea how commoners actually behaved. The money. They brought enough silver tableware, suitcases, and royal trinkets to fill an entire wagon, just in case they needed to set up a nice table setting while they were fleeing the revolution. They prioritized comfort over survival. They managed to slip out of the Tuileries late on the night of June 20th, 1791. They were hours behind schedule because Louis, utterly unused to dressing himself, had trouble getting into his disguise. The berline rumbled slowly eastward. The royal couple kept stopping to admire the countryside or to eat, further delaying them. The prearranged escort of royalist soldiers waiting at various stops along the route grew nervous, assumed the plan had been canceled, and rode off. The arrest at Varennes. The fatal moment came in the small village of Saint-Ménehould. The carriage stopped to change horses. The king, being Louis XVI, couldn't resist sticking his head out of the window to stretch. A sharp-eyed postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Douet looked at the large man in the bright green carriage and immediately recognized him. He didn't recognize Louis from life, of course. He recognized him from the French banknote of the time, the assignat. Douet looked at the profile on the paper currency, the royal profile, and then looked back at the large, awkward man in the window. It was a perfect match. Douet immediately galloped ahead of the slow, heavy carriage to the next village, Varennes. He alerted the local officials, who barricaded the small bridge crossing the River Aire. When the royal berline finally arrived in Varennes, they were stopped. The village mayor, a kind, stammering man named Sauce, invited the royal family into his house, which was also the local grocery store, while they waited for Paris to send confirmation. And so the royal family, the King and Queen of France, spent the night trapped in the upper floor of a local grocery store, listening to the murmurs of the growing, curious crowd below, all because a postmaster recognized the king's profile on a banknote. The return of the prisoners. The National Assembly was horrified when they heard the news. They immediately dispatched 3 commissioners to bring the royal family back. The journey back to Paris was even more humiliating than the journey to Varennes. The atmosphere in the countryside had shifted from respectful curiosity to open hostility. The carriage was constantly surrounded by jeering, angry crowds who hurled insults and dust. Lafayette ordered that the carriage be draped in revolutionary colors to protect the family, but it didn't help. Louis XVI arrived back in Paris on June 25, 1791, to an absolutely silent crowd of 100,000 Parisians. The silence was more damning than any roar. The message was clear: you are no longer our king. The National Assembly tried to cover up the whole affair. They claimed the king had been kidnapped by counter-revolutionary enemies, because if they admitted the king had fled, they would have to admit the need for a republic, and they weren't ready for that. They wanted the constitutional monarchy to work. But the flight of Varennes shattered the last shred of public trust. The revolution now had a king who had formally and publicly betrayed his nation. For the radical elements of Paris, the question was no longer if Louis XVI should be replaced, but when and how he should be punished for his treason. The constitutional monarchy was doomed, but the king's life, ironically, was still relatively safe, for now. That protection wouldn't last long, as the radical forces like the Jacobins began to gather their strength. Let's let this profound, embarrassing failure of a travel plan settle in for a moment. Next time, we'll see how this treasonous flight leads directly to the fall of the monarchy and the rise of the terrifying republic.
If you're still with me, we've reached a pivotal moment, a point of no return. The king and queen are back in Paris, residing in the Tuileries Palace, but they are completely discredited. The king tried to run away, and the people dragged him back. It's like a really messy, low-stakes family intervention, except the stakes are the future of France, the fiction of the Constitution. After the humiliating return from Varennes, the National Assembly spent the next few months trying to maintain the fiction that everything was fine. They finally completed the Constitution of 1791, which officially created the constitutional monarchy. Louis XVI, the man who had just tried to flee his country to raise an army against it, was forced to swear an oath to uphold this document in September 1791. Under this new system, the king was no longer Louis by the grace of God. He was now the king of the French. He had limited power, mainly a suspensive veto, the power to delay legislation, and the right to choose his own ministers. Crucially, the assembly dissolved itself and was replaced by the new Legislative Assembly, filled with younger, more radical politicians who were less personally invested in keeping the disgraced king on the throne. The royal family was now living in a state of quiet dread. Marie Antoinette, seeing her husband reduced to a powerless rubber stamp, redoubled her efforts to get external help. She continued to write to her brother, Leopold II, who was still the Holy Roman Emperor, begging him to intervene. Leopold II, however, was a classic bureaucrat. He did not want a massive, expensive war. But he was under intense pressure from the French émigrés, the nobles who had fled, who were painting a terrifying picture of republican mobs taking over Europe. The inevitability of conflict. This leads us to the most disastrous self-inflicted wound of the revolution, the decision to go to war. It's a deeply ironic moment, as both the revolutionaries and the king secretly wanted a war, but for completely opposite reasons. The revolutionaries, particularly the powerful faction called the Girondins, named for the Gironde region, believed war was essential. They felt that if they could export the revolution, they could eliminate the threat posed by the surrounding absolute monarchies. They were driven by a mixture of political idealism and economic anxiety. They also believed that war would expose the monarchy's true loyalties. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, on the other hand, also wanted war. Marie Antoinette was absolutely convinced that the French army was in such a state of collapse, with many of the best royalist officers having fled, that the foreign armies would simply sweep into France, crush the revolution, and restore Louis to his full absolute power. She was essentially betting against her own nation's army. And so, in April 1792, Louis XVI, completely against his own interests as a constitutional monarch, went before the Legislative Assembly and formally proposed a declaration of war against Austria. The Assembly agreed almost unanimously. The King and Queen quietly toasted the war. The Assembly loudly cheered the war. It was the only thing the King and the Revolution agreed upon, and it was the decision that would seal the King's fate. The collapse of trust. The initial months of the war were exactly as Marie Antoinette had predicted, a complete disaster. The French forces were disorganized, poorly led, and often ran away at the first sight of the enemy. The war went so badly that the Legislative Assembly, desperate, took two radical steps. They exiled all the non-juring priests, the ones who refused the oath, seeing them as counter-revolutionary agents. And they ordered the creation of a camp for 20,000 national volunteers called fédérés just outside Paris. Louis XVI, however, using the one bit of power he still had, exercised his suspensive veto against both laws. He would not approve the persecution of the Catholic Church, nor would he approve a massive armed camp of revolutionaries outside his window. This veto proved to be the final straw for the Parisian people. They saw it as the ultimate proof of his treason.
He was willing to let the country lose the war just to protect his priests and sabotage the capital's defense. On June 20th, 1792, the one-year anniversary of the tennis court oath, a huge, angry mob, mostly unarmed but frighteningly hostile, marched on the Tuileries Palace. They broke through the guards and surged through the royal apartments. Louis XVI, showing one of the few moments of genuine, quiet courage in his life, stood his ground. He put on a red, revolutionary cap and was forced to drink a toast to the nation. He stood there for hours, surrounded by the mob, but he refused to withdraw his veto. The mob eventually dispersed without violence, but the damage was done. The king's person was no longer sacred. The Brunswick Manifesto. The final, fatal blow came from the outside. The Austrian and Prussian armies, led by the Duke of Brunswick, were advancing toward France. In July 1792, Brunswick issued a proclamation, written in large part by the émigrés. It was called the Brunswick Manifesto. This document was intended to protect the royal family, but it was written in the most terrifying, arrogant terms imaginable. It stated that the foreign armies were coming to France to restore Louis to his full powers. And here is the kicker. If the people of Paris dared to harm the king or queen, the Allied armies would inflict an exemplary and unforgettable vengeance by delivering the city of Paris to military execution and total destruction. This document was instantly plastered all over Paris. It had the exact opposite effect intended. Instead of frightening the people into protecting the king, it confirmed every single suspicion of treason. Louis XVI was not just vetoing laws, he was actively collaborating with the enemy who promised to burn Paris to the ground. The people concluded that the king was the greatest threat to France. The end of the monarchy. The radical sections of Paris, led by revolutionaries like Georges Danton and the city's municipal government, knew they had to act decisively. On August 10, 1792, the most violent and consequential invasion of the revolution took place, the storming of the Tuileries Palace. A massive armed mob, including the newly arrived fédérés from Marseille, who brought their stirring new battle song with them, marched on the palace. The palace was defended by about 900 professional Swiss guards and a handful of untrustworthy National Guardsmen. Louis XVI, advised by his ministers, realized the situation was hopeless. Instead of making a bloody last stand, he made one final, characteristic decision to avoid mass slaughter. He decided to leave the palace and seek protection with the only legal body left, the Legislative Assembly. The royal family, shuffling through the Tuileries Gardens with the mob approaching, walked over to the Assembly building. Louis famously said as they entered, "I have come here to prevent a great crime." The king's escape from the palace left the remaining Swiss guards without orders. When the mob breached the courtyard, the Swiss guards, in a moment of tragic, unswerving loyalty, fired on the crowd, triggering a massive battle. The Swiss guards were eventually overwhelmed, massacred, and their bodies mutilated in the streets. The Legislative Assembly now faced a king who, for all practical purposes, was a refugee. They were terrified of the mob outside and realized they could no longer protect him. Under immense pressure, the Assembly passed two key decrees. They voted to provisionally suspend the king, the monarchy was over, and they called for a new legislative body, the National Convention, to be elected by universal male suffrage to decide the future form of government. Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and their children were immediately placed under arrest and imprisoned in a grim medieval fortress known as the Temple Tower. August 10, 1792, marks the definitive, brutal, and totally unavoidable end of the 800-year-old Bourbon monarchy. Louis XVI had gone from absolute monarch to constitutional monarch to just citizen Louis Capet, a prisoner awaiting trial. And it all happened because a nice man who preferred locks to politics was too indecisive, and his wife kept writing incriminating letters. Next time, we'll move on to the trials, the rise of radical terror, and the final quiet fate of the king and queen. For now, you can just let the sound of that terrifying silence in the Temple Tower settle you right down. The script has now detailed the constitutional monarchy, the declaration of war, the 2 fatal vetoes, the Brunswick Manifesto, and the final collapse of the monarchy on August 10, 1792.
All right, we're gliding into the darkest, most difficult part of this story, the period known as the Reign of Terror. But don't worry, we'll keep our narration calm and quiet. We're looking at the institutionalized paranoia and bureaucratic cruelty that consumed the revolution. When we left off, the king, Louis XVI, was now just citizen Louis Capet, named after the founder of the dynasty, Hugh Capet, and was imprisoned with his family in the dismal Temple Tower in Paris. Paranoia and the September massacres. The period immediately following the fall of the monarchy in August 1792 was one of absolute terror and instability. The French armies were still losing the war badly. Prussian forces had crossed the border and were advancing toward Paris, capturing key fortresses along the way. Parisian revolutionaries believed, with some justification, that the city was full of counter-revolutionary spies, émigré agents, and royalist sympathizers just waiting for the Prussians to arrive so they could launch an uprising from within the city. This paranoia, coupled with the highly charged rhetoric of radical leaders like Georges Danton, who was the Minister of Justice, created an atmosphere of complete crisis. Danton famously cried out, "The alarm bell that you are going to hear is not a signal of alarm. It is simply a charge against the enemies of the country. To conquer them, sirs, we must have audacity, more audacity, and always audacity, and France will be saved." The revolutionaries decided that they had to eliminate the enemies within the city. And this is where we encounter the truly chilling and low-level horror of the September massacres. From September 2nd to September 7th, 1792, mobs descended on the overcrowded prisons of Paris. They weren't organized by a central government decree, but rather driven by decentralized mob rule and incited by local officials. The victims were largely ordinary criminals, common thieves and prostitutes, but also hundreds of the non-juring priests and a handful of captured Swiss guards and royalist nobles. The mobs didn't just kill them, they conducted bizarre summary trials known as popular justice. A makeshift jury would be established at the prison gates. The prisoners would be brought out and asked a few questions. If they gave the wrong answer or were recognized as a priest or a noble, they were declared guilty and immediately dragged out to the courtyard and hacked to death. In 5 days, between 1,100 and 1,400 people were murdered. It was a bloodbath driven by fear and suspicion, completely lacking in any political goal other than clearing out the enemies of the nation. Crucially, the revolutionary authorities, including Danton and the city commune, did nothing to stop the slaughter. They tacitly allowed it to happen, seeing it as a necessary evil to cleanse the city before the real war began. This act of state-sanctioned inaction forever stained the reputation of the revolution. The Republic is born. While the massacre was still winding down, the newly elected legislative body, the National Convention, assembled for the very first time on September 20th, 1792. These delegates were elected by universal male suffrage, and they were far more radical than any previous assembly. Their first and most famous act, performed on September 21st, 1792, were short, simple, and utterly definitive. They formally abolished the monarchy. Their second act was to declare France a republic. This wasn't just a new system of government, it was a completely new era. They symbolically dated everything from the republic's founding, essentially saying that the history of France had only just begun. From this point forward, all legal documents would be dated as year 1 of the Republic. The clock had been reset. The trial of Louis Capet. With the monarchy gone, the convention immediately faced an existential problem. What do we do with citizen Louis Capet? They couldn't just keep him in prison forever. He was a potential rallying point for royalists and foreign powers. The powerful radical faction, the Jacobins, led by figures like Maximilien Robespierre, argued that Louis had to die for the Republic to live. Robespierre's logic was cold, simple, and horrifying. Louis must die because the fatherland must live. The king's person is not the issue. His existence is a threat to the Republic. If Louis was innocent, then the revolution was guilty. Therefore, Louis must be guilty. It was a purely political rather than legal argument for murder. The trial began in December 1792. Louis was forced to stand before the convention, which was acting as his judge and jury. He faced charges of high treason and crimes against the state, primarily his conspiracy with foreign enemies, the war, the vetoes, and the flight to Varennes. Louis, advised by his defense counsel, mostly remained calm and maintained a quiet dignity, which was actually quite unlike his usual awkward self. He consistently denied that he had ever intended to harm the French people. He argued that as king, he could not be held accountable by the Constitution, which he had ironically only just signed under duress. The vote and the verdict. The decision came down to a vote, held in January 1793. The deputies were forced to stand up in front of the entire assembly and state their verdict publicly. This was an act of extreme political pressure. To vote for acquittal was to declare yourself a royalist and risk immediate public denunciation. The final vote on the most serious question, what penalty shall be inflicted on Louis, was agonizingly close. Out of 721 deputies present, 361 voted for death, the bare majority needed. 26 voted for death, but only after a delay, a condition that was rejected. 334 voted for imprisonment or banishment. The king was condemned to death by a margin of just one vote. A very famous, utterly tragic, and profoundly low-stakes detail of the vote. Philippe Égalité, the Duke of Orléans, Louis's own cousin, a man who had sided with the revolution and even changed his name to Égalité, equality, voted for the death of the king. Because why stop being a political opportunist now? The last day. Louis XVI was told the verdict on January 20th. He asked for 3 days to prepare, but the convention, paranoid about royalist plots, granted him only 24 hours. On the morning of January 21, 1793, Louis Capet was taken in a closed carriage from the Temple Tower to the Place de Révolution, formerly the Place Louis XV, now the Place Concorde. He was brought to the scaffold. He attempted to address the massive crowd, saying, "I die innocent of all the crimes imputed to me. I pardon the authors of my death, and I pray God that the blood you are about to shed may never fall upon France." But before he could finish, the drums of the National Guard, likely ordered by Anton Joseph Santerre, rolled loudly and drowned out his final words. He was quickly bound and executed by the guillotine. Louis XVI, the shy, luck-obsessed king who never wanted the job, met his end with more dignity than he had shown during his entire 18-year reign. His execution sent a shockwave across Europe. It was not just the death of a man, but the definitive, final rejection of the divine right of kings. The revolution had severed its ties to the past with a single, brutal, and totally decisive stroke. But in doing so, it had unleashed the very forces of institutional violence and political paranoia that would soon consume its own leaders. Next time, we'll see how Marie Antoinette faces her own tragic end, and how the architect of the king's death, Robespierre, begins his quiet, terrifying rise to absolute power. For now, let that distant, muffled drum roll gently lull you.
We're deep into the cold, chaotic heart of 1793. Louis XVI is gone, having met the guillotine with a strange, final dignity. His death didn't settle anything. It only proved that the revolution was prepared to kill anyone it deemed an enemy. Now, the focus of the radicals turns to the next, most potent symbol of the old regime, Marie Antoinette. The Widow Capet. After Louis's execution, Marie Antoinette was officially known as the Widow Capet. She remained imprisoned in the Temple Tower with her two children, the Dauphin, now considered Louis XVII by royalists, and her daughter Marie-Thérèse, and her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth. For months, her life was one of grim, claustrophobic routine, completely stripped of the vast, luxurious entourage she was used to. The Revolutionary Guards treated her with a cold, petty cruelty, constantly searching her rooms, interrupting her prayers, and mocking her. The convention didn't execute her immediately because they saw her as a useful bargaining chip for peace with Austria. But as the war continued to go badly for France, and as the Jacobin faction gained complete control, her fate became sealed. The first truly cruel step was taken in July 1793. Her son, the little Dauphin, was taken from her. He was put in the care of a revolutionary cobbler named Antoine Simon, who was tasked with raising the boy as a good Republican. The psychological abuse the boy suffered was systematic and tragic, intended to break him entirely. Marie Antoinette never saw him again. The final insult came in August 1793, when she was moved from the relative comfort of the Temple Tower to the much more forbidding Conciergerie prison, often called the antechamber to the guillotine. She was held in a tiny, dark cell, under constant surveillance by two guards, stripped of all her remaining dignity. The trial of the Queen. The political climate in the autumn of 1793 had become completely dominated by fear, distrust, and paranoia. The Committee of Public Safety was now in full swing, and its unofficial leader, Maximilien Robespierre, was focused on eliminating all internal threats. Marie Antoinette's trial began in October 1793 before the Revolutionary Tribunal. This was not a trial based on law. It was a political show trial designed to confirm her role as the arch-villain of the revolution. The charges against her were vast, numerous, and often ludicrous. Treason, conspiring with foreign powers, her letters to Austria. This was certainly true. Wasting the nation's wealth, her ridiculous spending habits at Versailles. Organizing massacres, planning the attack on the Tuileries Palace, August 10th. The defense was practically non-existent. The final, shocking charge brought against her was arguably the most vile and politically motivated: incest with her young son, the Dauphin. This charge was forced out of the poor, abused boy who was made to sign a deposition by his captors. When this charge was read in court, Marie Antoinette, who had remained stoic through all the previous accusations, finally rose to her feet and spoke with quiet outrage, appealing not to the court, but to the women in the audience. She said, "If I have not replied, it is because nature refuses to answer such a charge made against a mother. I appeal to every mother present in this room." The audience, even the hardened revolutionary women,
reportedly murmured in sympathy. It was one of the few moments of genuine emotion in the trial. But it didn't matter. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. She was found guilty on all counts. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was taken to the same place where her husband had died, the Place de la Révolution. Unlike Louis, who rode in a closed carriage, she was forced to ride in an open, simple cart, charrette, through the streets, exposed to the insults and taunts of the Parisian crowds. She maintained a cold composure, staring straight ahead. Her famous, elaborate hair was roughly chopped off before the execution. At 12:15 p.m., the Austrian woman, the symbol of everything the French people hated about the monarchy, met the guillotine.
Fellow late-night historians, the air is thick with suspicion now. We are deep in the year 2 of the French Republic, 1794. The guillotine is running smoothly and efficiently, churning through enemies identified by the Committee of Public Safety. The quiet, intense man at the center of this machine is Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre was now at the absolute peak of his power, controlling France through the terrifying efficiency of the committee. But as is so often the case in revolutionary dictatorships, once the external enemies are gone, the focus turns inward. The revolution was about to start consuming its own children.